Hello everyone, we have Alisha Clock with us here today. We're going to be talking about everything cybersecurity, but before that, what does Alisha do? Alisha started her career with Boeing as a system security engineer. She's worked there for 4 years. Then she moved on to work at Google for 3 years as a security engineer, a TPM at Lyft and an engineering manager at Blue Owl for another 4 years. That's massive experience, Alisha. And Alisha brings all of this to Interview Kickstart as a technical mentor. She's helping us craft the curriculum for cybersecurity. She's structuring live classes for us, creating the curriculum for tests, for mock interviews. She also does one-on-one coaching sessions with our students at IK. So welcome, Alisha. We're going to be talking about security jobs, cybersecurity jobs, the whole industry, what companies are hiring, what roles to look for, etc. All right, so my first question for you, Alisha, is that, cybersecurity is a very broad domain, right? So can you take us through your roles as, in the technical side, and, because you worked as a TPM at Lyft, and on the managerial work that you've done so far in the whole cybersecurity industry?
Sure. So, like you said, I started out as a security engineer at Boeing, and there I was working on building security systems for government customers. Basically, we built the intrusion detection systems that our customers would then use to detect internal and external threats in their own systems. When I moved to Google, I essentially flipped sides and became the person monitoring the systems that detected external threats. I worked at Google's security team for a little while, moved over to their privacy team, watching for internal threats, basically. Originally their SOC looked outside and their privacy team inside. Eventually those two teams merged. And we actually combined our systems so that we had one single SOC that was looking for both internal and external threats. And as part of that work, what I was doing was building detection rules, detection processes, response tools, and making sure that we had all of the logs that we needed. So everything from the math logs from employees' computers to Unix logs from internal systems to Google Cloud logs, all of those were coming into our SOC, which we then would examine for signs of potential threats. After Google, I moved to Lyft, where I was helping them build out their security team. They had a security team when I joined, but they wanted to expand it, essentially broaden the scope to cover not just security software engineering, but also to start covering things like training programs for employees, legal considerations. This was when GDPR was just getting big, so they wanted to make sure that we were building to GDPR and so on and so forth. So that was a lot more relationship work, building relationships with other teams around the company, understanding what they need, and bringing all of that back into the security team so that then we could expand what we were offering. Then finally, most recently, I worked for Blue Owl, which is the technology company building the systems for a high road insurance company. So as part of Blue Owl, I built out their whole security team more or less from the ground up. We developed all of the secure software engineering processes. We built out all of the security policies for the company. We developed an intrusion detection and incident response system and processes. I hired up to, I believe I was at 9 employees across 3 teams by the time I left. And that was security engineering, so covering application security, security architecture, making sure that our systems were built with security in mind. Intrusion detection and incident response, so again, that watching for external and internal threats, and then finally a privacy team to handle consumer privacy issues and data protection.
All right. That is a wealth of experience, Alisha, and I think there's so much inspiration to get from the different roles that you have played in your career. Considering what we do at IK and what kind of audience we have, they're watching this video because they want to figure out how to crack these interviews, right, at all the top companies that you have worked for. So can you give us a short brief on what were your challenges while you were interviewing for these companies, all top companies, so go for it. Like what were your challenges that you faced back then while interviewing for them?
So the biggest challenges that I was facing while I was interviewing was the interesting problem of job specificity. So interviewing at larger companies, the job roles tended to be extremely specific. It was very much, this is the one thing that you're going to be doing, and we need you to demonstrate a lot of depth in one area. Whereas when I was interviewing at the smaller companies, they tended to have very broad job descriptions. In some cases, I was essentially interviewing for what amounted to 3 to 5 jobs at once. We need security. You're a security person, do security. And so I had to demonstrate a breadth of skill instead of depth. There was also an element of, especially at the smaller companies, coaching the people who were interviewing me. I was explaining to them how security works and what my job ought to be. Whereas at the larger companies, I was having to do a lot more probing of the interviewer to understand how specific is this role, what is its niche within the broader cybersecurity domain.
All right. I know it must be really long back when you interviewed for Google, but do you remember what were the resources that you used? Did you take up a class? Did you just rely on self-study? Did you do a lot of practice problems? What was your go-to strategy of cracking these interviews?
So my strategy has been a combination of self-study, so a lot of research of the company, of the role, trying to understand, like I said, especially at the bigger companies where they want you to have a lot of depth in a single area, identifying what that area is, and then making sure that I did have the depth of knowledge that they were looking for. So a lot of self-study. This was almost 10 years ago that I interviewed for Google. So there weren't as many interview courses as back then. So it was mostly on my own. I did connect with some others that I knew in the industry, some of whom had worked for the FAANG companies before, and got some advice kind of about general how the interview would go. And made sure that I followed that advice, but it was a lot of making sure that I had the depth of skill that I needed.
All right. So considering your experience in cybersecurity, how is the job market like? How is this whole industry doing? Are companies hiring in this role? What's the demand like? And whatever insights that you have on this whole job, this niche in particular.
Yeah. So the good news is that the cybersecurity job market is really, really, really hot right now.
Yeah.
And there's a lot more open jobs than there are workers. However, it's also a very confused job market, which I'll get to in a second. But kind of depending on who you ask, depending on on which statistics you look at, there's somewhere between 1.5 to almost 3.5 million more jobs than there are workers in cybersecurity.
Wow.
That's at least 1.5 million jobs that are out there that are there for the taking.
Yeah.
And that's good news for anybody who wants to break into cybersecurity. The tricky part is that part of the reason why that number varies so widely is because there's not a lot of consensus about what a security job looks like. A lot of companies haven't quite figured out what they want out of a security role. And so you have a lot of companies which are advertising for one job role that covers actually 3 to 5 different positions inside the company. So there's a lot of careful examination of roles that cybersecurity workers need to do to make sure that you're finding a role that matches your own skill set and that you're not going to be asked to do 5 people's jobs at once. The bigger companies, especially the FAANGs, are much better about this than the mid-sized and smaller companies. However, you do still see it at large, older companies that are just now catching up to the information technology age and are figuring out what it means to have security in information technology. So it's a very hot job market. There's tons of open positions, but interviewees need to look very closely at what the job is, at what the company is actually trying to hire for, and make sure that they're applying to a job that matches their skill set.
So you've hit the nail right. My next question was around cybersecurity is so complex, and you mentioned that the larger companies have figured out the team structure and what are the different job roles within security. So, since you've worked at these larger companies, can you share, throw some light on how a security team's like the org structure of it, and what are the several teams in that? What are the different roles that people confuse to all be security?
Sure. So at an extremely high level, there's kind of three domains within the security field. There's also the privacy domain, which is rapidly growing, and it is very closely related to security engineering. There's a lot of overlap there, although it's its own thing. However, a lot of companies tend to, right now, are including privacy hiring under the security umbrella. So I'll talk on that a little bit. But aside from privacy, there's 3 very, very high level areas within cybersecurity, and that is coding and application security. So basically, secure programming, the actual coding of security tools, building the software that people use to perform security tasks around the company, doing code reviews, anything that works with coding, basically. There's also a variety of what I loosely refer to as corporate security. This is the domain that covers network security, intrusion detection, incident response, cloud security, all the things responsible for making sure the business is secure, not necessarily the code product the business is producing. Some of these roles require coding knowledge. A lot of them don't, or only light programming, so maybe Python or Bash scripting. There's a lot more variability in the corporate security, like the business security, the corporate security side of things. And then finally, there's governance, risk, and compliance, which is the policy, process, regulatory side of security. So this almost never requires coding. You need to understand enough programming to be able to speak to engineers, but you're not going to be doing any coding yourself in these roles. This is where you're going to be interfacing with legal, with external auditors, with senior management to make sure that the company's goals, policies, and processes are aligned with the policies and federal laws and regulations of whatever country you're operating in. Within the programming side of things, like I said, you've got a lot of application security roles. These roles will tend to say things like application security, software security, security tools development, things like that are going to be in the job role or somewhere in the job description. On the corporate security side of things, you're going to be looking for roles like operations security, intrusion detection, intrusion analysis, incident response, network security, cloud security engineer, things like that, where it's talking about specific parts of keeping the business secure. The governance, risk, and compliance side, this is the most squishy, and especially in Silicon Valley, companies tend to lump all of these roles under extremely vague titles like program manager or just professional, so security professional or privacy professional or something.
Okay.
So it's a pretty broad field right now.
So, do companies confuse titles, or do they club titles just in smaller companies, or are we also seeing this in larger companies? I'm asking you this question more from the point of view of someone is looking to apply for these jobs. What kind of roles should they, be browsing?
Yeah, so there's no standardization of job titles in the field. It's a little frustrating. So when I was working at Google, the job title security engineer covered a lot of different actual roles. So I was a security engineer in intrusion detection and incident response. But at the time, the security engineer job title also covered application security engineers, the threat detection team, the people in Project Zero who take apart malware to understand, what's going on with that, and who look for zero-day vulnerabilities. So it was a very, very broad title at Google. And then if you go and search for security engineer on Apple, Amazon, Google, and Facebook's career sites, you get an extremely broad set of roles. Everything. I've seen network security engineer have the security engineer title, but I've also seen like network programmer, or I've seen intrusion analyst specifically, as opposed to security engineer. So it's extremely non-standard. Everybody has their own definitions. So my general advice when searching for job titles or for open jobs is to just stick security into the search field, see what comes up for that specific company, and then you can kind of narrow your search down from there. Because they'll tend to, somewhere in the description will be the word security, and then from there you can kind of get a feel for how that particular company names their security roles. Another good one, depending on which domain you're in, intrusion detection is another good keyword. Risk, governance or risk are good keywords. If you are in the privacy domain, privacy. But my recommendation for job seekers to parse out what job roles to look for at a given company is to just put those very broad keywords in and see how that company defines these different job titles, because again, it's not standard, it's not unified company to company, it's not always even unified within the company.
All right, thanks, Alisha. So you mentioned that the demand is way more than the supply. There are 1 million and more jobs available out there. So from privacy, application, network, ops, security, different roles, in all of these, are we seeing that companies are willing to pay more for any of these particular roles, or there is no such differentiation between the different jobs and the salaries that they're willing to pay? More so coming from the demand and supply side of things.
I haven't seen anything that is particularly different for security than for other types of software and software development roles, especially in Silicon Valley. There was a lot of We'll be nice and say a lot of concerns about Silicon Valley's hiring and their pay scale, and concerns about employee poaching, or a lot of that. So especially in Silicon Valley, the companies have extremely strict pay scale bands and try to avoid going out of those to avoid further concerns in that space. That said, from my own experience, the overall bands are starting to raise because it's so hard to get people in right now. And companies are more willing to negotiate within their packages. So as an example, some companies might say, here's our base salary and here's the stock and the benefits and so on. And they might offer you originally half and half. Half your total comp is in salary, half your total comp is in stock and other benefits. And they're more willing to negotiate within that. So if you're more willing at a smaller company that you think is going to take off big, you might be able to get away with a lower salary but a lot more stock. At a bigger company like Google, you might be able to get a higher base salary in exchange for lower stock because they want you on board. They just need to work within those bands that they've set up for themselves.
All right. How are the interview rounds different, with privacy, with application security, network security, security ops? Are the interview rounds, or let's talk about security as a whole, like the whole domain. What are the interview rounds like? What are the several interview rounds? And then maybe we can talk about how they vary for each of these different domains.
Sure. So broadly speaking, within Silicon Valley and within software engineering in general, you're going to be dealing with roughly a phone screen, which is just the first round to kind of see, are you at the skill level that your resume says and that the job role needs? Can you answer some basic questions? Can you speak intelligently about your role? Essentially, they won't say it like this, but are you worth spending 4 to 5 full-time employees' time on in an on-site interview? So assuming that you pass the phone screen, they'll usually do 1 to 3 rounds of on-sites. I think ideally they'd prefer to do as few as possible because, again, it costs time. It's hard to schedule. People, the managers who are hiring want to bring people on as quickly as possible, so we'll try and keep it to as few rounds as possible. This is also another place where, especially across Silicon Valley, companies are working very, very hard to standardize. So they all have very fixed interview processes to avoid any possible accusations of bias or anything. Pretty much everybody is going to be going through the same process within that company. But the process will probably differ from company to company, but within the company, they try and hold those processes very, very much the same in order to make sure that everybody has the same chance and experience. So that said, you're going to be facing 1 to 3 rounds of on-site interviews. The pandemic has changed this a little bit. When I was interviewing prior to the pandemic, it would often be 1 full day's worth of interviews. And so you just come in the morning, spend your whole day there doing 3 to 4 interviews all in 1 day, and then you leave, and that was it. And so especially as we move to remote interviews, those are now getting spaced out a little bit because you don't have to worry about bringing a person in, flying them in from somewhere. So there's some flexibility there. But they'll generally be covering whatever the main skills are for your role, and there will typically be 1 to 2 segments of each of your on-site per main area of your role. So intrusion detection, incident response, for example, you might spend a lot of time discussing intrusion techniques. So can you write a Splunk query? How would you handle an incident? Things like that. Whereas for a application security engineer, you're probably going to be spending a lot of time doing code reviews, perhaps writing a software tool yourself, pseudocoding it or otherwise. You might, something I've started to see a lot lately is companies will they stand up an application that is deliberately full of security vulnerabilities, and give you the opportunity to look at it to see, can you identify the vulnerabilities? And so there'll be similar kinds of things. For network security, you're probably going to be spending a lot of time working on an actual network, showing, again, can you find the vulnerabilities in this network? How would you set this up so that it's the most secure but also usable? Things like that. But going into depth on the areas that you would be asked to work on in that job role. And again, especially at the FAANG companies, you're looking at a lot of depth. You want to be able to demonstrate that this is your focus. This is really what you're good at. It's not bad to have some breadth and be able to allude to breadth of experience, because that shows you'll be able to work with other teams on things. But especially at FAANGs, you're in a very specific job role and they need you to do that job. And so they're going to be digging into how well you can do those specific tasks.
All right. So Alisha, a lot of our students, I think Google is the hottest of the hottest companies, right? So everyone's aspiring for Google. What makes someone Google material? Or have you noticed anything different in Google interview rounds that only Google checks for? Or, something that's very core to Google when they're hiring, when they're looking to hire someone in their company that you haven't, that you don't really see in other companies. So is there something specifically about Google interviews and what they look for?
I would say creativity, and the ability to think flexibly, to change how you're looking at a situation. So I don't know if they still use this particular question, but when I was interviewing at Google, one of the things that they asked me was, okay, you have a blank check to build your own security system, your own intrusion detection incident response system. And we spent a lot of time talking through that, what that would look like, what tools would I use, what kinds of things would I set up, where would I place my defenses, all of that. And then, so we spent like a good hour and a half, I think, covering that. And then at the end of it, they turned around and said, okay, now you're an attacker. You need to get into that network. And so suddenly this network that I had just spent an hour and a half securing and showing that hopefully was foolproof, I had to find a way in. So that kind of being able to invert or alter your way of looking at a problem, to see things from different angles in order to understand the full scope of it. Because it's very easy to say, I'm only concerned about defense. I'm only worried about defense. But if you only ever think about how am I going to defend this, you're going to miss those interesting sideways things that attackers look for when you're building your own defenses. One of the really cool projects that Google had running while I was there, they would actually ask non-security people to attempt to break into different systems, specifically to give the security team a chance to see how non-security people thought about security.
Yeah.
And they found a lot of very interesting and obscure bugs and vulnerabilities that way, because you're just dealing with people who don't think the same way that your SOC team does, your security intrusion detection team does.
All right. So Alisha, your experience working as an engineering manager, you must have interviewed several candidates. You also do mock interviews at IK. So what are some of the common mistakes that you see candidates making while interviewing for security roles?
The most common mistake, and the one that I most often will reject a candidate for, is not being able to admit they're wrong and being unwilling to ask questions. That's so important. And not just that they're wrong, but also that they don't know. I see a lot of people, when faced with a question where they don't know the answer, they'll try and make something up, and it's painfully obvious that they're making something up. If I'm going to work with you as a manager on my team, I want to know that you know when you need to ask a question. I want to know that you're not just gonna try and do it yourself and bull rush your way through and cause a lot of problems. So saying, I don't know, can you tell me more? And you being able to ask specific follow-up questions. And then also, if you do start going down a path and you're wrong in the interview and I correct you, whether it's a factual correction or like sometimes we'll do role play scenarios and people make assumptions about things and I might have to correct an assumption. So they might assume that we have a lawyer, or they might assume that we have access to this particular type of log. And I might say, well, we don't actually. And sometimes people flounder and don't know what to do when that happens. Whereas what I'm looking for is somebody who can adapt, who can say, I understand, I'm going to change how I'm approaching this. And it's okay, by the way, I tell candidates this all the time, it is okay to stop and think. Tell me that's what you're doing. Say, okay, you've given me new information, I need to think about this for a second. I'll often invite candidates to think aloud so that I can make sure that they're not continuing to go down wrong paths. But working through the problem is much more important than being able to, come up with the right answer immediately on the fly. Like that's what I'm looking for. That's what I'm looking for, people who know the limits of their own knowledge, can ask questions, can adapt to new information, new situations, and who can work with me as a member of my team.
That's also a great manager there, Alisha, because I think what you gave us right now is also like a great advice for managers. All right. So I wanted to understand, you're training students at IK, and if you had to give students advice on what are the resources that they should use, what is available on the internet for free, any books that they should buy, any paid courses that they should take, or can they do this completely with free resources? So if someone is trying to crack an interview at Google or at Lyft or at Blue Owl, any of the big companies, what are the few resources that they should start with their prep?
I would, my actual first piece of advice is to do mock interviews with anybody that you can. With, if you have a friend, it doesn't matter if they don't know anything about security. You can Google, security interview questions pretty easily. And, even just do them with a rubber ducky sitting on your monitor if you need to. But practice speaking the answers, practice thinking through those problems. Being able to discuss these things with somebody, and that's completely free. You can do that with anybody, anywhere, anytime. Broadly speaking, I would say it's very possible to nail one of these interviews, to land one of these roles using only free resources. You're going to have to work a little bit harder, but this is very much not something that's gated on having money. There are a lot of very good free resources out there, and a lot of it, again, comes down to practice and understanding your own knowledge. That said, having access to a course like what Interview Kickstart does, it's going to help you focus your studies in the areas that matter, and it gives you direct access to people who do perform these interviews for these companies, so they're going to have a little bit more experience with doing those mock interviews, and are going to be able to give you a more realistic, mock interview experience. So there's definitely advantages to being able to attend a course like Interview Kickstarts, but it's not gated on that. You can get in. You can study and teach yourself and get there without having to spend money.
All right. So you also structured the curriculum for IK, and the live classes, the tests, the assignments. So what is your thought process when you're teaching someone? What is the journey that you're trying to get them through? Like study A and then B and then C. What are these A, B, C different components that you as a mentor focus on?
So it'll vary a little bit depending on which of those four very broad domains we're working in that I talked about. But generally, what I'll try and do is build on each course. So we'll start with something that's fairly fundamental. So for intrusion detection and incident response, we'll probably start by talking about what are vulnerabilities, what kinds of things do attackers look for? What are some common indicators of threats? So if you have, for example, 10 failed logins to an account, and then immediately after a successful login, is that a threat? Is that not a threat? And why? And under what circumstances? And so we'll talk through these and get through the idea of, what do these things mean? And then from there, we can start diving into different specific areas. So now we understand what those logins mean. Okay, now let's talk about how are we capturing these logins, which gets into host intrusion detection, network intrusion detection, and then as well cloud security. How are we capturing all of these things? How are we bringing these logs in? That'll lead us into parsing logs. So we'll start talking about, so the most common one is Splunk programming language, or Splunk query language rather, but also like query languages for writing searches for alerts. We can move from there into, okay, now that we've detected these, how do we respond to them? Given what we have available to us in these logs, in this data, how do we respond to these events? How do we make sure that we can get everything that we need to respond correctly and efficiently? And then also, how do we turn that around and feed it back into the beginning of the cycle to say, okay, somebody got in or almost got in. How do we close that hole? And so it's a journey of building on the foundations, picking a point to start with, and then building from there into a complete like job role or area of expertise.
All right. So we often get asked by our students, how important is coding? Is coding really that important in security interviews? What's your take on that? And you touched upon this briefly, where you mentioned the 4 subdomains and how coding is. If you can tell us a little more about how important coding is for each of these 4.
Yeah, so it's extremely role dependent, and this is why I strongly encourage a lot of research into what roles you're applying for.
Yeah.
I'm not a programmer. I've never been a programmer. I can do some Bash scripting, a little bit of Python, but I'm not a programmer, and that means that I've had to be very careful when I'm going through jobs, because like I mentioned, sometimes security engineer as the job title means someone building software, programming, writing code. Sometimes it means intrusion detection or intrusion analyst who isn't writing code. They might be writing scripts, or they might be writing queries, but that's a completely different thing. So broadly speaking, when you're looking at application security jobs, software security jobs, so either securing the product, making sure that the code that makes up your product is secure, or building the tools used for security. Google writes most of its own internal security tools, just because of how big and specialized its systems are. It needs to have equally large and specialized tools to do security, and so you'll have people who have to build those tools, and that's not necessarily that's not the same as somebody who is checking for vulnerabilities in external facing product code. It's a different side of understanding what security needs and how to build these tools in order to give the security teams what they need to do their jobs. So there's a wide variety of programming and coding knowledge required in that whole domain. Within the business security side of things, it varies a lot. And it also tends to be much more specialized types of coding languages. So again, if you're working on the IT team, security team, for example, you might need to know Mac scripting more than you need to know, say, C++ coding. It's related to programming, but you're not going to be like on Stack Exchange or Code Golf or something like as much. network security can involve programming, but much more often involves a really detailed knowledge of networking files and settings and how to get Cisco routers to do what you want, which means understanding the unique Cisco language that it uses. So it tends to be a lot more specialized rather than the, if you can code in Java or Python or whatever the latest hotness is, Go, things like that. That tends to be more on the application security side, and then in the business or corporate security, you're going to be dealing with a lot more specialized scripting languages or query languages usually.
All right. So Alisha, how do you, if you have to give someone resume tips or application strategy, like how do you get noticed among all the applications that come into a recruiter? So how do you make your application pop, stand out, and what strategies would you use, to reach out and to get noticed by these recruiters?
So there's two very specific things that I both do when I am applying and that I look for when I'm reviewing, and that's shortness and brevity. So basically, if I have to read paragraphs to get through your resume, I'm gonna look at one or two and make a call from there. Don't waste your time writing giant long paragraphs.
Yeah.
Give me one or two sentences tops, or a very short bullet point list highlighting the biggest things that you've done, your biggest accomplishments, the key areas that you focused on in that role. So keep it short and very easy to skim. So again, like long paragraphs, big blocks of text, people don't read those. We don't have time. I'm not exaggerating when I say that I've had days where I reviewed 20, 30, 40, 50 resumes just in an hour or two. I just don't have the time to sit there and read long paragraphs of text. So short, skimmable, very easy to see the highlights. And then within those highlights, you want to look for what are the keywords in the job role that you're applying for, and try to tailor your resume to bring those highlights out. Mm-hmm. And so it does mean that you can't just have one resume that you send out 100 copies of to you do actually have to spend a little bit of time tailoring it to the job role. And so look for the keywords that are in the job role. If they call out Splunk, for example, or if they call out we do all of our coding in Python, or if they call out we only use MacBooks here, or whatever, pull those out, highlight that as close to the top as you can, as close to the beginning as you can. Make it very clear that you have experience with the things that the job role is looking for. Keep it short and tailor it to the role.
All right. Thank you so much, Alisha. That's it. Those are the only questions I had for you, and that was so informative. I think it's going to be very helpful for anyone watching this video and trying to, crack a security job at any of the FAANGs. Before I let you go, do you have any last advice? Like, what's your golden advice to someone aspiring for a security role?
My golden advice is don't give up. It does, just like with any interview process, it's going to take a little bit of time. It's going to involve finding the right role for you. That role is out there. There are up to 3.5 million unfilled security jobs. There's a right role for you out there. It's a matter of learning to read the job roles, to understand what they're looking for, and then to present yourself in a way that gets you noticed so that you can show off your skills in the interview.
All right. Thank you so much, Alisha. And that's a great background. Thanks a lot. Have a good day. Yes. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Bye.